After the stunning fall of Syria's government, the Biden administration is rushing to keep terrorists from filling the void left by overthrown dictator Bashar al-Assad.
The end of this regime is a defeat for all who enabled its barbarity and its corruption. None more than Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia.
Rebels took Damascus over the weekend after more than 5 decades of brutal rule by the Assad family and a nearly 14-year civil war. The main rebel group that toppled Assad is led by a former senior al-Qaeda member who is now promising a representative government.
We're prepared to work with anyone in Syria who wants a stable, inclusive, democratic future for that country. That's what we intend to drive towards.
Assad fled to Moscow as the rebels closed in after Russia and Iran helped prop up his regime for years. President Biden spoke with Jordan's King Abdullah Monday, pushing for a regional solution.
Anything like this rebellion that diminishes Russian and Iranian influence and power in the Middle East is good for the United States.
On Sunday, U.S. bombers hit around 75 targets linked to the ISIS terror group to prevent them from taking advantage of the power vacuum.
And we have kept the pressure up on ISIS now through the entire 4 years of this administration through these kinds of strikes. We'll continue to do that as we see valid threats.
President-elect Trump could reverse course on Syria, posting on Truth Social, quote, "This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved." In Washington, Caroline Shively, Fox News.
Thank you to Caroline for that report. Let's dive into this subject matter even further by bringing on to the program now Osamah Khalil. He is a professor of history at Syracuse University. Osamah, so let's kind of start with that ending point from that report and give us a description on the U.S. involvement in Syria and really what could happen once President-elect Donald Trump takes office.
Well, so there's roughly 900 U.S. troops still based in Syria, occupying some key areas in a coalition with Kurdish forces. They are occupying some of the oil fields that Syria has. And they've been there, obviously, since the Trump administration, dating a little bit back further to the Obama administration. But President Trump kept them there and left them there when he left office. And President Biden has continued that. So the U.S. has launched roughly 75 to 100 airstrikes against ISIS targets. One of the things that wasn't mentioned in the report is that Israel has launched over 300 airstrikes and has actually expanded the area that it occupies of Syrian territory some 20 kilometers, taking advantage of the fall of the Assad regime to expand the territory that it occupies. And it continues to actually bomb Damascus and other cities around Syria, and has been doing that all day and from yesterday.
So you mentioned a little bit there. We do have some footage here because we know that Israel kind of taking hold, seizing some territory there within Syria, what they're calling a buffer zone. Khalil, explain a little bit more about these key nations that are placing themselves as we're seeing this government collapse in Syria. Not just Israel, but we're also hearing from Turkey saying that some of their allied forces have also seized a town there. What do we know from that?
So Turkey's in the main driving seat here. Turkey has been the main group that has actually not only supported the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who was pictured in the report, but they have also been funding, quite frankly, and supporting remnants of ISIS. So it's one of these tricky situations where we have a key U.S. ally and a NATO ally that's been one of the main sources for funding al-Qaeda groups in Syria, ISIS in Syria, and they have played a double game here. The other thing that Turkey wants is they want to get rid of any presence of a Kurdish parastate or a Kurdish mini-state in and around Syria, something that they would view as an existential threat. So there's a real potential here for Syria to be divided into mini-statelets, so where you could have a Turkish allied statelet in and around Idlib province, where HTS was largely based just up until really 10 days ago. And then, of course, the Kurdish region that is now allied with the U.S. in eastern Syria, rather. And then in the south, you have U.S.-backed opposition forces that were also trained in coordination with Jordan. And then, of course, you have the Israelis who have seized additional territory. And in between, you have an amalgam of former regime forces. You have what's left of HTS. You have the potential for other forces to step in. What really needs to happen here is for the Biden administration to work with and ensure with its European allies, with its Arab allies, Syria's territorial integrity, ensure a transition to a democratic government, and ensure that all Syrians will be protected. And in fact, part of that's going to be about promising the relief of sanctions for refugees who want to go home, that they can go home, and of course, for Syria to be brought back into the family of nations, both politically, economically, and culturally.
And we'll talk about some of these refugees that are already making their way back into Syria in just a moment. But first, I want to touch on Russia and Iran, because both of these nations really key allies when it came to the Assad regime. And we know that Russia kind of embroiled in its own war with Ukraine, Iran dealing with their situation with Israel. The situation in Syria, does that change the priorities for both Russia and Iran going forward?
Well, I think somewhat. I mean, so Iran has actually had some difficulties over the past year with the Assad government, and there had been some tensions emerging, all of which kind of came to a head over the past 10 days. What the Iranians have said is that we had tried to warn the government of Bashar al-Assad that the rebels were planning an attack. He ignored them. When Aleppo fell very quickly, the Iranians expected, as they've reported, that they expected Bashar al-Assad would reach out to them and ask for assistance. He didn't. And then they began to make plans for evacuating their citizens and the military advisors that they had in Syria. We are getting reports that Jolani, the head of HTS, has reached out to the Iranians. We're also getting reports that what's quite different this time is several things. Jolani and HTS have promised now to safeguard all Syrians, regardless of their religious identification. So whether they are Sunni or Shia Muslims, whether they're Christian or any of the different ethnic minorities that are in Syria, so that includes Kurds, Druze, et cetera, that they're all being guaranteed protection. That remains to be seen whether that's going to be carried through or not. I mean, we're hearing mixed reports. And in fact, on the one hand, while you have some Syrian refugees coming back in to Syria from places like Turkey, where you have a huge number, over 2 million Syrian refugees, you have another 1 million next door in Lebanon. We're also seeing other Syrians, particularly of the different ethnic and religious minorities, who are fleeing, who are afraid of what's going to come next. So this is a tragic situation that's been going on for 14 years after 5 decades of a brutal dictatorship, a family-run country, and now you have refugees going in 2 different directions: some trying to come home, and some fleeing for their lives. So in the case of Iran, what now has to happen is they're going to want to safeguard, at least at a minimum, protection of the Shia minority inside Syria, and of course, the Shia majority, quite frankly, in Lebanon. What protections can they get, and what promises can they get from HTS and, of course, its key supporters, whether that be Turkey or Qatar, to protect the religious minorities and religious groups and different sects within Syria and, of course, in Lebanon.
So here on your screen, you are taking a look at some footage of some of these refugees coming back into Syria after they were displaced. Now, what are they going to encounter within this new realm? Of course, they're looking for a more peaceful future, but really, you touched on it a little bit, what it would take for Syrians to actually see that. So when we're seeing these refugees kind of streamline in there, it's been a few days since this entire offensive happened, since the collapse happened, but really on the ground, what could they expect?
Syria is in a very difficult situation. It's been hollowed out by very extreme sanctions that were imposed during the civil war. Some of them date pre-civil war, right? So Bashar al-Assad, who had been under a heavy sanctions regime already before the civil war kicked in, Syria has the dramatic impacts. You have a couple combinations. You had a heavy sanctions regime really dating almost into the 1990s, if you will, but that they were amplified in 2005 and then amplified again when the Syrian civil war kicked in. You also have the impact of COVID that's still lingering, that everyone has encountered, and that was particularly dramatic within Syria. So you can imagine all of the inflationary issues that Americans have encountered, how much that would be exacerbated in the country under heavy sanctions. And that's one of the things that Syrians have gone into. So you have high unemployment, you have a very low currency, you have a scant amount of goods. So it's a very difficult situation. At the same time, they're still rebuilding from the civil war. So that's one of the things the sanctions has prevented. You know, if the Syrian civil war, if you want to mark the end of it, say in 2015, 2016, you're talking about 8 or 9 years post-civil war in which they're still reconstruction going on that's been limited by the sanctions. So Syrian refugees who are coming back, nobody wants to be a refugee, but Syrian refugees who are coming back are going to encounter even a very difficult time. Now, what's at the moment, they don't have to worry about being persecuted by the regime. But the security situation inside Syria is also still very fragile and very tense. You don't know what you're coming back into. You don't know how quickly it could turn. You don't know whether some of the different factions, whether it's HTS or what's known as the Syrian National Army, which used to be called the Free Syrian Army, whether they're going to start fighting with each other. You don't know what the situation is between, for example, HTS and the Syrian National Army and the Kurdish militias. You also don't know what the situation is with ISIS. So it's a very difficult situation. And on top of it, you have the Israelis who are doing airstrikes repeatedly across the country. So it's a difficult situation, but you're still seeing people come home, but you are also seeing people fleeing. So unfortunately, it's still very early in this process. And what needs to happen, and what we've seen already, is so the HTS, led by Jolani, has announced a transitional government. But there is a very large, broad-based expatriate Syrian activists and civil society in both in the United States and in Europe that need to be involved in that transition. And so what needs to happen now is to see whether or not Jolani and HTS really mean what they say. Are they going to have an open, inclusive Syria? Or is this just kind of rhetoric that they're saying in order to, while they try and secure power?
Well, Osamah, really, you have answered all of the questions that I had for you, but is there anything you feel that you should add, maybe something we didn't touch on, or what you really have your eye on going forward throughout the next several days?
Well, I think we want to see how the security situation internally in Syria develops. What we want to see is, for example, are Syrian refugees allowed to come home? What is the state of the political prisoners inside Syria? What does it mean for when we hear the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talking about what the United States is looking for? And at the same time, we need a commitment from the United States, from its European allies, and quite frankly, from the Israelis, for Syrian territorial integrity. We need a commitment that, in fact, Syria is going to be lifted off the sanctions and that there'll be a commitment to restoring its economy. We also need to see, for example, a number of European countries, including France, Germany, the UK, Austria, have all stopped asylum or halted asylum processing for Syrian refugees. So are Syrian refugees going to be forced out of those countries? Are they going to be sent home without really knowing what they're going into? This situation could turn on a dime, quite frankly. It's still very unstable. You know, the other thing you want to wait and see after 5 decades of rule by a family and its extended patronage network is what kind of revenge attacks take place. We're already hearing some reports of some of those. You can expect more of that in the coming days and weeks. And then how does that spill over? Do we start to see, for example, some of the different countries, whether it's Turkey, Israel, Jordan, or Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, do they start vying for power with inside Syria and backing different factions? All of this is very tense right now. What it needs is American leadership and the leadership of European allies. And so that's one of the things that President-elect Trump is going to inherit. What is he going to do about Syria? And keeping in mind there are 900 U.S. troops still there.
Osamah Khalil, a professor of history at Syracuse University, a lot to really monitor as we see the situation develop in Syria. So we hope to connect with you soon and see really what comes of this.
My pleasure.
We do want to step away for another commercial break here at Live Now from Fox. Before I do so, though, I do want to bring up a tweet here from the Associated Press. It says this: as daylight broke over Damascus, crowds gathered to pray and celebrate after the Syrian government collapsed early Sunday, falling to a lightning rebel offensive that seized control of the capital and ended 50 years of iron rule by the Assad family. We'll be right back.